Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Partial funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Hello everyone, I'm Bryce Duskett and thank you for joining us today on Market Journal. As always, we have a lot of ground to cover on today's episode. That includes a look at how the University of Nebraska is utilizing phenotyping technology on the farm. We'll also get a breakdown of the latest news that is impacting the grain markets with Heartland Farm Partners President Jeff Peterson. We'll get to both of those stories here coming up in a little bit, but first. The Nebraska FSA has some news that could be beneficial for some producers. Back in mid-October, the U.S. Department of Agriculture announced that certain distressed borrowers have received nearly $800 million in assistance as part of the $3.1 billion in assistance for distressed farm loan borrowers. These funds were made possible by the Inflation Reduction Act, also known as the IRA. The bill directed USDA to expedite assistance to distressed borrowers of direct or guaranteed loans administered by USDA'S Farm Service Agency whose operations face financial risk. Work has already begun to bring some relief to distressed farmers. Currently, over 13,000 borrowers have benefited from the resources provided under the Inflation Reduction Act. Approximately 11,000 delinquent direct or guaranteed borrowers had their accounts brought current. USDA also paid the next scheduled annual installment for these direct loan borrowers. Furthermore, approximately 2,100 borrowers who had their farms foreclosed on and still had remaining debt have had that debt resolved. This is just the first step in what USDA calls their effort to provide assistance to distressed farm loan borrowers and for their ability to respond to farmers and improve the loan servicing efforts at USDA by adding more tools and relaxing unnecessary restrictions. Additional announcements and investments and assistance will be made as USDA institutes these additional changes and improvements. You can find more details on each category of assistance, including a downloadable fact sheet on the Inflation Reduction Act at the website farmers.gov. We've also added a direct link on the Market Journal website. Moving on, and last week we brought you some beef quality assurance tips for the ongoing fall run. While there are still several considerations to keep in mind when it comes to the cattle side of things, there are some other things that the driver should keep in mind before that long haul.
Yeah, so whenever a driver is about to make a long trek with a group of cattle, we often tell them, get the cattle loaded as quickly as possible, but they need to do that in a calm manner. They need to make sure that they're not stressing those animals out before they put them on the truck, that they're not bumping each other around in there too much as they're going into the trailer, causing any additional bruising. A couple other things that they should be cognizant of is when they do got to make stops, they need to make those stops as quickly as possible, especially depending on what kind of ambient temperature we're dealing with outside. So if we're transporting cattle in more the warmer months like August, September, if we had to do early weaning like we did this year, there's a possibility that it's super hot. We need to move those cattle as quickly as possible so that they're not sitting on the trailer for long periods of time with being exhibited to that heat stress. When it's colder, as we roll into these fall, cooler months, we need to make sure that we're paying attention to the how cold it is and what the wind chill factor might be for those animals. We don't want to cause any damage to the frostbite or anything like that. Typically, we don't see that unless the hide or the animal is wet in some way. That's when the most stress is exhibited, when they're wet and cold. With the drought that we're experiencing right now, we don't see a whole lot of moisture in the air. We're not too concerned about that, but that's something that drivers need to be aware of.
If you have any questions or concerns about transporting cattle, we would suggest you take a quick visit over to the website beef.unl.edu. There you can find everything you need to know about BQA guidelines and nutritional advice for your herd and really everything in between. Up next, it's no secret that most Nebraska producers are currently dealing with severe or extreme drought conditions. Several livestock producers are currently looking for access to forage and winter feed resources. We were joined earlier this week by Jay Parsons to discuss how the University of Nebraska's crop residue exchange is helping by facilitating those connections between livestock producers in need of forage with crop producers that have available crop residue. Well, Jay, talk to us about the crop residue exchange. Broadly speaking, what is it?
It's an online exchange to get basically to bring crop producers and livestock producers together, predominantly for corn residue. I mean, we call it a crop residue exchange, so it doesn't have to be corn. But most of the stuff that's grazed in this state would be corn residue. But we have a lot of cattle producers that are looking for corn residue opportunities as far as grazing goes during the winter. We have a lot of corn growing in the state, obviously, and so the exchange is there to give crop producers an opportunity to list what they have available, so livestock producers can find them and conduct that transaction and get their cattle out on their corn stalks.
Understand stocks have been a bit of a hot commodity this year, right?
Yeah, they're pretty well in demand every year as far as most of our cattle do end up on corn stalks, but we grow so much corn in this state that we usually have some available. And this is one of those years where we just have a huge drought going on, and it's pretty much across the state, and everybody's looking for forage. So things are being basically bought up pretty quickly in terms of grazing resources.
Talk to me how the exchange works. What's that look like if someone's interested in listing something or going online and seeing what's available around them?
We try to make it as easy to use as possible and as simple, right? So there's minimum exchange in there as far as information that you have to put in. If you're a crop producer, you can go on and there's a Google Map tool in there that you can basically say, this is where my property is, this is the acres I have available, the type of residue, whether I have fencing or water, just lay it out, and then you're asking price for it. And you can rent it by the acre, AUMs. There's several different options on there, per head per day, and so on. And then your actual contact information is not shown to anybody that's not a registered user. And so that puts it online, and you have contact of email and or phone. And then a livestock producer would go searching for it. And if they see a property that's available, that's near them, that they might be interested in putting some cattle on, they then, as long as they're registered, they can get your contact information and contact you, and then you take it from there. We don't do anything in terms of actually negotiations or liaison between them. We just bring people together and give them an opportunity to conduct some business.
What's the cost to use this?
It's absolutely free, so there's no cost. It's just your little time to put your information up there. And I can tell you from years past that any crop producer that puts their corn stalks up there is likely to get several inquiries on people wanting to use it and rent it from them. So if you have corn stalks, we encourage people to get online and list them available for the cattle producers, because everybody's looking for them.
You mentioned years past. You guys have been doing this for a few years now. What have you heard from those producers that are able to sell their crop residue, or the livestock producer able to make that connection? What have you heard from them from years past?
Well, in general, from the livestock producers, we usually hear that, hey, we wish there was more up there, yeah, right? Because they're always looking for it. Crop producers, like I said, they have not had any trouble at all getting them listed. And some of them will list, they'll list one circle of corn, for example, and say, I got 10 other circles just like this. So if you want to know something, come and find me. And they're basically making those transactions, developing those relationships, and then those relationships continue for the several years to come. They don't have to go find each other. They know each other's phone numbers and just pick up the phone and give each other a call. And that's really the general purpose of it. We're not there to collect data, not there to do anything onerous. It's just a matter of bringing people together that need each other's resources.
Jay, we appreciate the time. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you for having me on.
Now, if you're interested in signing up to list your crop residue, or if you're interested in searching for crop residue listings available for potential grazing, you can do so by visiting the link we've posted at the bottom of your screen now. And if you're seeking more information on the Crop Residue Exchange program, we've taken the liberty of posting an informative article along with this story. You can find them both on the Market Journal website. Turning our attention over to the grain markets now. This week, we were joined by Heartland Farm Partners President Jeff Peterson, and we had the opportunity to discuss the latest trends when it comes to the markets. One of the big stories this past week has been the status of the grain corridor in the Black Sea. We had a chance to ask Jeff his thoughts on that, but began the conversation by getting his general thoughts when it comes to the grain complex.
Well, it's always interesting this time of year, Bryce, because we're transitioning from where everybody's worried about the supply. We're coming over to the demand side. We're watching, those weekly export sales close. And unfortunately, right now on the corn side, we're just not quite getting enough exports. The hope is we'll see more of that down the road. We've got a situation in South America where they're moving along, getting that crop planted, except you're experiencing some dry pockets in the southern parts of, down in Brazil, southern parts of pockets of Brazil, and also more so over into Argentina, and that's slowing up the planting. You've got some added geopolitical risk out there with the talk now with Iran, potentially some type of attack going over to Saudi Arabia, so that's got a little bit of life in that energy market, and then you've got all the uncertainty that's this grain corridor is bringing about. So that's kind of what sets the stage right now, Bryce.
You mentioned the grain corridor. Let's dive a little bit into that conversation. You and I visiting here on Wednesday afternoon. I feel like I have to say that because things change so quickly, particularly when talking about Russia. Russia's reversal, though, is the talk today in what's going on with that grain corridor. Give us what you know about that at this point.
Yeah, so as you dig into it, it's really been a great success overall. The amount of bushels they've moved out, some would estimate they've probably moved about 320 million bushels out of there, maybe over 400 shiploads. But you've got a tremendous amount of ships sitting out there kind of in no man's land up until when Russia said, hey, we'll step back in. Now, what we don't know is when they said that they're going to step out, all because of the attacks that they have on their Black Sea, basically, fleet, we don't know necessarily what that meant, whether that was going to cause them to blockade these ports, the 3 ports that are coming out of Odessa. But what we do know is there's still probably over 100, maybe 150 ships that are kind of still sitting in limbo a little bit. They're starting to move. They think everything's going to be normal, but we got to remember, we've got a decision date coming up here soon. And ultimately, we're going to have all those parties agree on whether or not we're going to go forward with it still. So I'd say this thing is not a done deal by no means yet, Bryce.
We did see news, though, today, and that made the wheat complex fall pretty hard, right?
Oh, it did, definitely. Just like what we ended up having, though, the minute we saw the announcement that the grain corridor, Russia was stepping out of it, everybody assumed that was a shutdown. What that assumed then is that there wouldn't be that wheat coming out. Immediately, wheat shot up. And we're going to have more of this type of action just back and forth.
Let's switch commodities, talk about corn. I want to interject a viewer question we received this week. Had a viewer chime in and noted that corn futures seem like they don't want to get above $7 and stay there. Why might that be, Jeff?
Yeah, so when we go back and we look at kind of what the fundamental value of grain is, and the way we do that is we look at that stocks to use ratio, it would suggest as we get up in that area, we're approaching an area where under the prevailing conditions, we'd be a little bit overbought. So what that ends up meaning that no one's willing to stick their neck out. The speculators aren't willing to physically buy it until we get some news strong enough to break us through that area. And what it says right now with everything that we have on the table between the hedgers and the speculators, that's an area above that they just do not see the conditions warranting additional purchases.
On the corn side of things, Jeff, basis still red hot. I think that leads to the question of, could it be even better later? Could it be? Your thoughts?
Well, I don't think we've reached the top here yet, but something I really, and we were just talking about this in some of our meetings this morning that we have to think about is that let's just kind of set the table on what's going on with basis. We're coming out of harvest. We had most areas here in the Western Corn Belt, we ended up having a slightly smaller crop, especially if you had a little bit of dry land. Some areas, you don't have much crop at all if you go far enough west. And what that meant is a lot of bushels were able to be stored. So a lot of these, whether it be elevators, whether it be end users, ethanol plants, feedlots, what they were looking at is they were saying, hey, we need to get these bushels. Didn't quite get as much as they wanted for a couple reasons. The farmer was able to store more of them, but also in some cases the farmer didn't quite sell as much. One, he was uncertain about what there was going to be for bushels, and maybe he didn't necessarily need the money necessarily either. So now we've got this little void in here, November, December, where the bin doors are closed, and now we're trying to coax these bushels back out, and really the only tool these local buyers have, if they can't get the futures price to move, which they can influence that, they have to go ahead and perk up this basis. So what I'm thinking, Bryce, is we may have to set some basis levels much sooner this year than what we think. Mm-hmm. November, December has a chance of being some of the highest basis levels of the year, possibly.
Something to keep an eye on for sure. In terms of soybeans, here at the midweek, they've been rallying a little bit. Is there a reason for that this week? I
think so. I think if you go back, so we introduced some geopolitical risk with the talk that there could be some attacks from Iran over into Saudi Arabia, and that's boosted this crude oil market a little bit. If we take a look at where the crude oil market was trading, we'd have to go back, if we closed in this area, back to about, in the first part of October to see a close higher than this. Anytime we start to see that happen, then that boosts up what we'd see as a fair value over on basically the soybean oil, and we've already got extremely good crush margins. But when we see that happening, there gets to be some additional demand that would pop over on the soybean side, and that's what we ended up seeing today.
Give you the final word this week. What would you like to leave us with?
Well, I think right now, this time of year, you need to focus on know exactly where you're at in regard to what your break-even costs are, get a good idea what your cash flow needs to be, and get ready to make some sales in here. I think we're getting really close.
Jeff Peterson joining us this week. Jeff, appreciate the time.
You bet. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, as always, to Jeff for sharing his insights with us this week. If you have a question you'd like for me to ask next week's grain and market analysts, feel free to email us or get in touch on social media, and I'll be sure to pass your question along. Back in 2019, the lone grocery store in the village of Lynch, Nebraska, population 212, closed its doors. This forced area residents to travel miles and miles down the road to get their basic food for their tables. But a dedicated group of volunteers banded together to establish the New Valley Foods Cooperative, and they reopened the grocery store there in Lynch. For many residents, this effort was literally a lifesaver. You can learn more about how Lynch accomplished this monumental task in the November issue of the Nebraska Farmer. Well, it is once again time for weather with Nebraska Extension Ag Climatologist and Market Journal Chief Meteorologist Al Dutcher. Well, Al, the month of October is in the books. How are things looking as we're now into the month of November?
Well, Bryce, we did see some nicer temperatures earlier in the week and under some dry conditions, sunny skies, no winds, and then we seen the big trough coming in that was advertised last week. Came in about a day earlier than originally forecasted, but the same result. We've seen pretty good thunderstorm activity to our south, and then some of that left into eastern Nebraska. We did see some drier slots with this system, unfortunately, for the western part of the state. But we did get a pretty active storm system moving across the country, and we're still dealing with that. But before we get to the main forecast, I want to bring an update on CPC's November forecast. From a preliminary now, they've issued their final forecast for the month, and the first thing we'll draw your attention to is above normal temperatures have been shifted toward the eastern United States, centered over the Great Lakes, and an introduction of below normal temperatures across the Pacific Northwest and the Northern Rockies that's even been pulled farther toward the south. And in terms of precipitation, much more aggressive precipitation pattern across the western United States, and with loss of signature of above normal moisture across the Ohio River Valley and the introduction of above normal moisture just to the south of us. So this indicates a more aggressive pattern, especially for the first 2 weeks of the month, and that's exactly what we're seeing with this first storm system, and we have many to come after it. So if we look at this upper air pattern for today, we're looking at the upper air low itself moving across Iowa and rapidly shifting toward the northeast. Then our attention will turn to the west with another trough coming into the region. So for today, light precipitation ending by the midday period across the east, maybe dealing with some cloud cover and cooler conditions, primarily in the 50s, where we do see some sunshine in the southwest, probably making up into the 60s. Now, as we go into the day tomorrow, as that trough lifts up, we'll see another piece of energy, the northern stream portion of this energy move toward the Great Lakes, stay north of Nebraska, so we'll probably see a very tight temperature gradient. Most of the coolest conditions will be to our north. We'll actually probably make it into the low 60s across the southern part of the state. So we go into Monday, this trough really starts to dig down the western United States coast. That's going to allow warming into our region, bringing our temperatures up across the state into the 60s, maybe even the mid to upper 60s across the southwest. By the time we get to Tuesday, trough starts to make a little bit of inroads into the southwest. Even warmer conditions and a little bit more moisture moves into our region in advance of this front. We're still going to be primarily in the 60s across the state with a potential in the southwest and south central to make it up into the low 70s. Now, as we get into the day on Wednesday, we'll start to see this trough coming into the Rocky Mountains. So the first piece of energy starts to shoot out of this, maybe generating a few light sprinkles across the panhandle, maybe some light rainfall. But for the remainder of us, we should stay dry and warm. And then the real action starts to get into the game as we get into Thursday, as this trough starts to lift out into the plains, a lot of energy with it, deep moisture fetch, possibility that we will see some pretty significant moisture somewhere in the central plains. And right now, Nebraska is in that forefront of that forecast. We'll see if this changes. And then by the time we get into Friday, this system rapidly moves toward the Great Lakes. Look what's behind it, another big system. So 8 to 14-day forecast continues the trend of below normal temperatures with the next trough coming in terms of precipitation. We're right in the bullseye for another storm system as we get into early next weekend.
Thank you for that information, Al. Well, the physical characteristics of a plant can reveal a lot about the underlying genetics. This can help us answer questions like how much water does the plant use, or how quickly will the plant grow? By linking traits like these to specific genes, researchers are seeking to improve crops by providing higher yields for farmers and gaining greater food security worldwide. The science of capturing these characteristics in plants is called phenotyping. We recently got a closer look at phenotyping experiments taking place at the University of Nebraska Lincoln. Market Journal's Bill Dodd has the story.
Until recently, Phenotyping had been a very time and labor-intensive practice. In the not-so-distant past, researchers had to rely heavily on the looks, touch, and feel of a plant. However, now technologies such as drones, robots, cameras, and laser scanners can measure a field of plants in nearly an instant. One tool that has been immeasurably useful for phenotyping is the University of Nebraska's SpiderCam.
So SpiderCam is really a very advanced phenotyping facility that Nebraska has invested. And so we set up this field experiment. It's about 1 acre in size. And those experiments can ranging from the genetic study to a study of the nitrogen use efficiency, or study of the biomass production for the energy crops, and really in the hope to find what is the best performing genetics, right? The varieties in the field, or are there any ways that we can manage the nitrogen or water more efficiently, so that we can either save those resources or enhance the efficiency of the plants to use those resources. So all those are within the objectives of our study. So phenomics in that sense is really very widely applied.
As one of only 3 of its kind in the world, this SpiderCam isn't the type of tech your everyday crop producer will have readily available on their operation. However, the work being done with this machine may someday be applied to unmanned aerial vehicles or drones.
Because you can imagine UAV is small, and they are very much limited by their battery, and with that limited payload, what kind of scientific instruments you are going to use is very critical, and what time you fly the UAV is also critical. For example, we have always found out, in order for you to understand the water use, like the drought stress of the plants, the best way to fly UAV is really not in the morning, but right after the mid-noon, in the afternoon when the plant is most stressed. Your chances to be able to look at the stress symptoms is highest when you fly the UAV that time. So therefore, SpiderCam accumulated a lot of the scientific evidences and the data, so that we can translate those information better to the UAV systems. And the UAV is heavily used now for the plant breeding purpose, but also even for the larger acre management system. UAV is also used. So we can already see what I'm referring to as the transition of the technology from the pure research to the applied or the production system, and that's already happening with SpiderCam to UAV.
As input costs have continued to rise over the years, researchers working with the SpiderCam technology are already seeing how the data recorded with these systems can lead to better decision-making and ultimately mitigate a sizable fraction of necessary operational inputs.
Today, we are doing research on nitrogen use efficiency and being able to identify the genotypes that is more efficient, and hopefully later on that we can incorporate those specific genes to the commercial varieties. And also we are looking at what are the best technologies really being able to tell which plant is more nitrogen use efficient, right? So that has something to do with using remote sensing and looking at the crop canopy. And the conventional knowledge is greener the plants are, probably more nitrogen they have in their body. But there's a lot more than that, right? So and the nitrogen is a very complicated issue inside of the plants, and there's various chemical forms of nitrogen, and the phenomics is trying to allow us to do better than we just shallowly looking at the greenness of the plants, but we're really trying to tackle a lot of other chemical forms that hopefully we can use remote sensing to be able to tell what is nitrogen concentration, for example, in the plant's leaf. And those would translate into the more advanced technologies, maybe 5 or maybe 10 years later, when the technology cost reduced, then we can be able to apply that at thousands of acres out there, millions of acres.
As growing seasons come and go, the field phenotyping facility near Meade continues to churn out new data every year. Soon enough, you may see new applications of this technology readily available for producers in their fields. Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Bill Dodd.
Some fascinating research there. Thank you for the story, Bill. If you'd like to learn more about phenotyping and ways that which UNL is helping to create the farm of the future, we've added an informative link along with this story on that Market Journal website. Well, happening this past week, over 60,000 FFA members attended the 95th National FFA Convention and Expo, which took place in downtown Indianapolis. That is a lot of blue jackets. This year's convention was an opportunity for students to attend workshops, compete in national competitions, and network with students from across the country. Nebraska FFA members performed very well at this year's convention. Placing 5th overall individually in the meets evaluation contest was Broden Dean of the Eustis Farnham FFA chapter. For his chapter, it's all about the preparation.
It's a 13-hour drive for us. When we come up here, we're studying all the entire way up here. We stop at colleges and they set up workouts for us, so that's really cool. And then just here, like, you get in the cooler and everyone knows what they're doing. It's a little intimidating, but keeping your cool is probably the most important part of that too.
The Eustis Farnham FFA chapter was a gold emblem meets evaluation team. There was also 3 Nebraska FFA members who earned a top 4 spot in their respective National Proficiency Award categories. Madison Hirschman of the St. Paul FFA chapter was a finalist in the area of diversified livestock production.
My SAE is actually in beef entrepreneurship and sheep production. In my beef entrepreneurship SAE, I have 25 cows, Red Angus and Charolais purebreds that I just have on my farm. In my sheep production SAE, I have 12 ewes that I just raised on my home farm. There are 8 ewes, and I just grew my flock ever since. So.
Jordan Howell of the Howells Dodge FFA chapter and Maria Cup of the Imperial FFA chapter were also top 4 proficiency finalists. 7 Nebraska FFA chapters received the highest 3-star national chapter rating, plus several Nebraska FFA members were national agri-science finalists. Well, that is all the time we have for this week's show. Do remember, if you missed a story, be sure you're following the Market Journal team on YouTube and on social media to join in on the conversation. We hope to see you back here next time. Until then, I'm Bryce Tuskett, wishing you a safe and productive week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.
Partial funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.